Mojave, posted by J. Rubus. The puke green Prius died northwest of Barstow. They were following a cracked secondary road through one of the many alkaline flats dotting the Mojave when white smoke began to seep from the hood. The engine knocked, coughed and sputtered, then went out with a low, wounded death rattle. At the wheel, Alex, Ace Freeman, cursed and slammed the horn in the passenger seat. Bobby Jarvis glanced nervously out the window. Thirstily scrub bush grew alongside the highway, and in the distance craggy, last blasted mountains thrust up against the cloudless blue sky. "I guess we're fucking walking," Ace hissed through his teeth and got out. He kicked the front tire and pain snaked up his leg. He grimaced but did not give a voice to it. Bobby got out of the car and shut the door. He didn't speak. He had known Ace for 3 years and 7 months and knew well enough to leave him alone when he was mad. Parking his hands on his hips and sucking his lips into his mouth, Ace looked both ways along the desolate, sand-coated blacktop. The last car they'd seen was a battered Ford pickup 17 miles back. Great, he chose this fucking route just for this reason. Fewer people, which meant fewer chances of being seen. Now they were fucked. Capital T, totally fucking fucked. Sighing, Ace leaned back into the car, grabbed the revolver from the center console and stuck it in the small of his back, covering it with his shirt. "Come on," he said, and started walking west. Bobby followed. He still didn't speak. "Luck's a funny thing, isn't it?" Ace Freeman had always had rotten luck from the moment he was born to the moment he wound up at Rockbed State Prison. Some people flitted through life on clouds of tinker dust and unicorn farts, but not him. Oh no, he had rotten parents, a rotten childhood, rotten friends, a rotten job, and rotten fucking everything else. Anything that could go wrong for him did. He watched as other people lived, laughed and loved, and he fucking hated them. His hatred grew as he did, and by the time he was in his mid-20s, he was beating winos to death with baseball bats and shoving old ladies down big flights of concrete stairs, because fuck them. When he was 29, he robbed a liquor store and shot the clerk for the hell of it. 3 weeks later, the LAPD kicked down the door of his motel room and took him in. The judge called him soulless. Yeah, and whose fucking fault is that? He should have known. He really should have. He plotted his escape for 8 years. He thought he had everything down. He thought it was going to work for him. But then, while he and Bobby were sneaking out, a guard cornered them, and Ace had to beat his face in. Bobby was fucking useless, just standing there and hugging himself. Ace only brought him along to throw him under any buses they might come across, and Ace was really fucking hoping that bus came by soon. In his original plan, he'd have at least 5 hours on the pigs. The way things actually went, he was lucky if he had 2. "Ace," Bobby said hesitantly. Ace ignored him. He really didn't feel like putting up with Bobby's shit right now. He never even liked him in the first place. Thin wavy hair, fair skin. He looked like a faggot. Killed his mommy and daddy when they were sleeping. because he didn't have the nutsack to do it when they were awake. Pussy. Ace hated pussies. Ace. What? Ace asked, spinning. Someone's coming, Bobby said. Ace looked back, just as a dark blue panel van topped to rise and passed the Prius a half a mile back. Ace's heart jumped into his throat. The cops! He reached for the gun, but froze when he saw that it wasn't the cops at all. Cops don't drive old Chevy vans with hippie murals painted on the sides. No fucking body in their right minds drove hippie vans with paintings on the side, except hippies. And hippies were easy to rob and kill. Donning the biggest smile he could, he waved his hands, and Bobby, taking the hint, did likewise. The van passed them in a cloud of dust and pulled to a rolling stop. A man with a bushy blonde beard stuck his head out of the passenger side window and held his hands up to his eyes to cut out the glare of the sun. "Where are you going, man?" he called. He was wearing little John Lennon sunglasses, a battered brown sun hat, and a dirty tie-dye shirt. Groovy, Ace thought. Just fucking groovy. "Any way's better than this way," Ace called back. "Hop on in and take a ride, man," the hippie replied and laughed. "This is the magic bus." Ace flashed a toothy smile and turned to Bobby. "You hear that? It's the magic bus." Bobby smiled nervously. Ace went over to the side door and opened it. The first thing that washed over him was the stench of unwashed feet. The second was the smell of freshly burned marijuana. The third was a ripe, sickly sweet odour that he couldn't place and didn't want to. Inside, the van's cargo bay was carpeted shag. Because of course it was. Trippy tapestries and a poster of Bob Marley hung on the walls. A thin pale woman in red tank top sat next to a mini fridge. A gangly man with oily black hair and wearing a leather vest and dirty jeans lounged on the beanbag. His face brightened when he saw Ace. "Hey man, what's up?" he blurted. "You coming to Burning Man with us?" Right then and there, Ace decided to kill them all. "If that's where you're going," Ace said as he climbed in. Bobby followed, pulling the door shut behind them. Only then did Ace notice the second woman. She was close to the back doors, her knees drawn up to her chest. She rocked gently back and forth like a nut in a padded room. Ace hesitated, a funny feeling in the pit of his stomach, then sat, probably on acid. Fuck turds. Like these are always taking bad trips and never coming back. "Burning Man isn't for months," the man behind the wheel said. He was the most normal of them all. He was older, with a greying beard and moustache, his eyes blue and hard in the rearview mirror. He was dressed in a denim work shirt, a giant peace sign emblem around his neck catching and refracting the rays of the sun. "I'm Dave," he said, nodding to Ace. He indicated the man in the passenger seat. "This is Robert. The lady in red is Sherry, and that's Dex. He's an imbecile. Took one too many tokes and got his mind broke," Robert said and laughed. "You're not far behind him," Dave said, shooting him a menacing look. "I'm Steve," Ace said. "This is my brother Georgie." "Nice to meet you," Dave said. He turned around and put the van in drive. "You guys broke down, huh?" "Yeah," Ace said. What are you gonna do? They don't make 'em like they used to. He stole a glance at the woman in the back. She was muttering to herself now. Sounded like she was crying. Who's she? We call her kitchen bitch, Dex, and tittered. She does all the cooking and cleaning. Name's Princess, Dave said, 'cause that's what she acts like. She don't talk. Ace nodded and looked at the girl again. He didn't know how he knew it, but something wasn't right here. He nudged Bobby in the side, but he was stupid, so he didn't catch the drift. Fine. Ace reached behind his back, brought out the gun, and sat it next to him. Where you going? Sherry asked. Vegas, Ace said. George is getting hitched. Sherry nodded and sized Bobby up. Lucky lady. Ace detected a hint of sarcasm. Well, Ace said, shrugging, he's a great guy. I'll bet he is. That rubbed him the wrong way. Bobby was a dumb, faggy piece of shit, but he belonged to Ace. He had half a mind to whip the gun out and blast the stupid bitch in her face. You want to smoke a joint? Dex asked. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and wet with madness. He took a joint out of his vest pocket and held it up. It's good shit. They call it Mexicali Brown. He tittered. It'll make you feel like you're walking on sunshine. I'll pass, Ace said. I get drug tested at work. Dex plopped the joint into his mouth and lit it, never breaking eye contact with Ace. It's good shit, he said again. Thick, noxious smoke filled the cab. Yeah, okay, Alex said. It has H in it, man. Robert said. He was on his knees looking over the headrest like an overgrown kid. I wouldn't smoke it if I were you. You just smoked some an hour ago, Sherry said, taking the joint from Dex and sucking on it. Robert flipped her off. He wore a piece of fabric tied around his wrist. Dad, Sherry said, Robert's trying to fuck me again. Sit down, Dave said, swatting Robert's ass. You're going to break my seat. Seat's already broken, man, Robert said, and threw himself forward. The seat toppled over and Robert crashed to the floor like a drug-addled oak. His head landed on Bobby's lap. Dex screamed laughter and stomped his feet. Sherry choked and dropped the joint. God damn it, Dave roared, glancing into the rearview mirror. I'm getting really sick of your shit. Robert sat up. Sorry, bro, he said to Bobby. I didn't hit your nuts, did I? No, you're fine, Bobby said. Good. Sitting next to Bobby now, Robert threw his arms around him and drew him close. He looked at him over the tops of his glasses. Hey, he said, with his free arm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plastic wand. Do you mind if I bubble? You start blowing bubbles in my van, and I swear to Christ, Robert, I'll kick your ass. This is fucking crazy. Alex shook his head and glanced at Kitchen Bitch. She had drawn herself into a corner. He could hear the sound of her softly weeping. Meanwhile, Robert pushed the seat back up and climbed into it. We like to cut loose, he said, looking over the headrest. Have fun. He pulled something out of his pocket and pointed it at Dex. A red dot appeared on the latter's head. Dex, Robert cried. Sniper! Dex jumped up and threw his arms out like a little girl with a spider on her dress. He kicked Ace's foot and Ace almost reached out and grabbed him. Stupid bastard. Knock it off, Dave said. Robert deposited the laser back into his pocket and turned around. A moment later, he looked back over his seat. He was holding a bottle of sparkling brown liquid. Anyone thirsty? Yeah, Dex said. Give me some. He scooted over and Robert poured some into his mouth. It splashed on his shirt and chin. God damn it, Dave screamed. He reached over and whacked Robert in the small of his back. Robert screamed and dropped the bottle, which clunked Dex in the face. Ace watched in a mixture of horror and amusement as Dave pelted the younger man with a flurry of punches. I told you to knock it off. That stupid shit. The van started veering to the right, but Dave used his knees to bring it back to the middle of the road. Stop hitting me, Robert wailed. I'm sorry. Stop hitting me, Daddy, please. Dex giggled as he appended the bottle. Dave discontinued his assault and took the wheel in his left hand. With his right, he pointed sternly at his son. You get too goddamn wild. You think it's okay to act like a damn fool. You're stupid. You're a fucking moron. You need to learn some goddamn manners. I'm sorry, Robert said in a whisper. I was just having fun. Then, where's my captain? Dex just finished it, Sherry said. Dex held up the bottle with a sheepish grin. He's the captain of my belly now. Kitchen bitch let out a strangled sob. What's with the girl? Ace asked. Dex crawled back over to his beanbag and climbed onto it. We call her kitchen bitch because she does all the cooking and cleaning. Yeah, I know, Ace said. Why is she crying? She stubbed her toe, Sherry said. I'm getting really sick of your snarky little tone, Ace said, pointing at her. Why is there a girl all balled up and crying in the back of your van? Her mother just died, Dave said. She's taking it hard. I think you're full of shit, mister, Ace said. You're the one who's full of shit, Sherry said. That Prius you were driving's all over the news. You're those escapees. Suddenly, Dex had a razor in his hand and started to move forward. Ace brought the gun up. Don't move, asshole. Palin. Dex dropped the knife and fell back, raising his hands. No, you don't move. Robert was facing him again. This time he had a pistol in his hand. It was pointed directly at Ace's head. Sherry brought up a shotgun and pumped it. Ace's heart sank. Next to him, Bobby looked stricken. Give the gun to Dex, Dave said. He was a pair of evil eyes in the mirror, stern, sparkling, evil. If you try anything, you're dead. Got it? Ace took a deep breath. Mexican standoff. Robert drew with a little smile, man. He was right. Hating himself and feeling 3 inches tall, Alex handed the gun to Dex. He took it with a jittery hand. Be careful you don't blow your dick off, Robert laughed. Dex pointed the gun at Ace and smiled. Don't move, asshole, he said and giggled. Official police business. Get out of the car. Get on your stomachs, Dave demanded. Both of you. Ace didn't move. Now. He looked for a way out but saw none. He had 2 choices, do what they said or die, and though his life wasn't much to look at, Ace didn't feel like dying. Okay, he said, putting his hands up. You got us. Stomachs, now. Ace got onto his stomach. Next to him, Bobby did the same. You're harshing my mellow with this shit, Robert said sadly. He dug his knee into the small of Ace's back and bound his wrists with rope. I thought we were done for the day. When he moved on to Bobby, Ace tested his bonds, tight as a 10-year-old's arsehole. Finished, Robert sat them both up. Sherry kept the shotgun across her lap, but was busy puffing a joint. On his beanbag, Dex held the gun on Ace, but stared into space with a glazed look on his eyes. In the back, kitchen bitch openly wept. "Shut up," Robert said, a hard edge to his voice. He knelt down in front of Ace and smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the laser pointer. He shined it in Ace's eyes, and he winced. "Sniper," he said. "Get that shit out of my eyes," Ace said, and was mildly surprised when Robert slapped him across the face. "You don't get to be big and bad now," he said. He grabbed him by the chin and leaned closer. "Only I get to do that." With that, he stuck his tongue into Ace's mouth. Jerking, Ace clamped down with his teeth. Robert's eyes went wide, and the coppery taste of blood filled Ace's mouth. Making muffled sounds of agony, Robert hit Ace in the cheek and pulled back, red gushing from his mouth. "He bit me," he screamed. Dave glanced into the rearview mirror. "He fucking bit me." Ace laughed. "Move," Sherry said. She moved past Robert and brought the stock of the shotgun up. Ace opened his mouth, but when it cracked his forehead, the world went black. Visions and sounds swam in and out, mad laughter, pained screams. Robert with his tongue stuck out. Sherry threading a needle. Dex, his eyes ceaselessly open. "You hurt my brother. Now we're going to hurt you." When Ace came fully awake, red afternoon light bathed the van. His head ached and his neck was stiff. "Look," Dex said, clapping his hands. "She's awake." Ace lifted his head, and a bolt of agony flashed across his skull. He felt like he was going to puke. "Hey sis," Sherry said. Ace looked at her. She was grinning. "What?" "Sis." Coming to him, Sherry held up a mirror. Ace blinked. His lips were ruby red, and his eyes were heavily shadowed. "You're not a full woman yet," Dex said and laughed. "We're going to do that tonight." "What are you talking about?" Ace croaked. Dex knelt in front of him and produced the razor. "We're going to use this," he said, and then slashed Ace's cheek. "Like this, on your junk." Ace cried out at the pain. Dex and Sherry both laughed. "Hey up?" Dave asked. "Yeah, Dad," Sherry said. "Alright, good. Guess we'll stop soon." 15 minutes later, just as Ace was starting to drift back off, the van left the road and he was jostled awake. "It's a bumpy ride," Dex warned. For what felt like an hour, Ace was shaken and thrown around. Then the van stopped. "Alright," Dave said. "Everybody out." Dex threw open the door and cried, "Geronimo!" and jumped out. Sherry followed. A moment later, Robert appeared at the door and without word dragged Ace out and threw him to the ground. The air left his lungs in a rush. He tried to get to his knees, but Robert snatched the back of his shirt and dragged him over to the van's back wheel, where he sat him up. "You hurt me," Robert said drunkenly, and shoved his finger into Ace's cheek. "But I still love you, bro." Dave came around the front of the van and stretched. "Get the other one and stop fucking off." Nodding, Robert disappeared into the van and returned with Bobby. Ace was shocked. Both his eyes were swollen shut. His lips were split, and purple bruises dotted his blood-caked face. "What the fuck did you do to him?" Ace blurted. "Nothing compared to what we're going to do to you," Robert said. dropping Bobby in the dirt next to Ace. Robert went away and Ace had time to take stock of his surroundings. They were in a clearing high in the hills. Ahead, the earth fell away, and Ace could see vast expanses of hard pan, like a frozen ocean. To his right was a rock-strewn hillside, to his left a giant rock formation. Dave, Dex and Sherry were busy setting up camp. While Robert unloaded things from the van, Dex did something wrong, and Dave yelled at him. In 10 minutes, they had erected an awning over a 10-foot wide space, white fabric draped over wooden tent poles. Robert brought in stones for a fire pit, while Dex grabbed an armful of wood from the back of the van. "Bobby," Ace said. On the ground, Bobby didn't move. Bobby, nothing. Was he even alive? For the first time, Ace was truly scared. "All right," Dave said. "That's everything, right?" "I think so," Sherry said. "Good." Dex, grab me my chair. Dex nodded and rushed away. A minute later he returned with a green canvas camping chair, which he sat up next to the fire pit. Dave pushed him away and sat down just as Robert got to the wood to catch. The sun was sinking fast. A chill sprang up. "All we need now is the food," Dave said. "On it," Sherry replied. She passed Ace and disappeared into the van. After a few long minutes, Kitchen Bitch fell into the dirt. Ace watched as Sherry climbed out, dragged the woman to her feet and led her into the camp. She was crying and trembling, shaking her head and whispering, "No, no, no, no." Dex grabbed her and helped Sherry get her to the ground. Robert squatted over her, blocking Ace's view. From the motion of his hand, however, it looked like he cut her throat. Dave cracked a beer and took a long swallow, followed by a contented sigh. Jesus Christ, these people are nuts. It took Kitchen Bitch a long time to die. She thrashed and strangled like a fish on a pier. Soon, Ace could barely see her, her body only revealed in the soft firelight. "Can I do it, Daddy?" Dex asked. He was standing by his father's chair, his hands drawn to his chest as if in prayer. He bounced giddily. Can I? "You gonna do it right this time?" Dave asked. "Yes, I promise." Dave gestured him away. "Go on." Ace watched as the madman fetched something from a box and came back. He shuddered when he saw it. Was a hacksaw. While Dave coolly drained his beer and his children stood around him, Dex cut Kitchen Bitch into several chunks. Ace finally looked away. "Bobby." Nothing. Damn it. He was alone. He tested his bonds. Tight. He balled his hands and flexed his wrists. The rope dug painfully into his flesh. He flexed away. "Clean the meat off," Dave said, "and hurry, I'm hungry." Dave washed the meat off, handing it each successive piece of Sherry, who cut them smaller still. Ace's wrists burned. He gritted his teeth and kept flexing. Was it his imagination, or did it feel like the rope was getting looser? Sherry tendered the meat while Dex sat at his father's feet and happily played with one of Kitchen Bitch's hands, making airplane noises and crashing it to the ground. The sickly sweet smell of burning flesh filled the air, and Ace's stomach turned. Soon dinner was served, and the cannibals dug in. Ace closed his eyes and continued working on the rope. It felt looser, not by much though. When dinner was over, Robert came over to the van, leaned into the side door and brought out the radio. Dave cracked another beer. Dex went back to playing with the severed hand. Sherry stared into the fire. Robert switched the radio on and loud country music blared forth. Ace worked. God, his hands hurt. He didn't think he was bleeding yet though. When he did, he could use the blood as lubricant. Focused on that, he ground his wrists into the rope as hard and as fast as he could, baring his teeth against the pain. In camp, the mood turned jovial. Dave knocked back one beer after another, becoming looser and laughing more. Robert took deep pulls from a bottle and after a while started hollering and making animal noises. They were talking, laughing, having a good old time. Sick bastards. Ace boiled down on his teeth and used his rage as fuel. The rope was looser now, but he wasn't bleeding, and it was still too tight to slip out of. He was so concentrated on what he was doing that he didn't hear Robert coming until he was almost on top of him. "Time to party," he said boozily. "You wanna party?" He grabbed Ace by his shirt and dragged him to his feet. The smell of alcohol rolled off the hippie in waves. "We're gonna cut your pee-pee off and eat it," he tittered. "Then me, Dex and Dad are gonna fuck the hole where it used to be." Ace rubbed his wrists against the rope. Was that blood he felt, or was it sweat? Close to the fire, Dex grabbed Ace's shirt and grinned. You ready? You ready? Huh, 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 huh. Ace's hands were covered in blood now. He pulled his right hand against the rope, and it came part of the way. "Pull down his pants," Dave said from his chair. Dex fumbled at Ace's zipper, while Robert dug his finger into his shoulder, not to keep him from running, but to keep himself from falling over. Ace pulled, and his hand came free with an agonized rip. He elbowed Robert in the ribs, and the hippie toppled over with a scream, landing in the fire. Dex jerked and looked up. Ace punched him in the face. He went down in the dust. In the fire, Robert screamed, the flames searing his flesh. Dave started getting out of his chair, but Alex grabbed him and slipped his arm around his neck. Sherry was dragging Robert out of the fire by his arm. On the ground, Dex moaned. Dave thrashed, but Ace tightened his grip. In a flicker of firelight, he saw the razor on the ground. Moving slowly, he bent down, grabbed it, and put it to Dave's throat. The old man's resistant faltered immediately. "All right," Ace panted. Robert was on his hands and knees, Sherry kneeling worriedly next to him. She shot Ace a withering glance. "Looks like the shoe's on the other foot now," he barked with laughter. "Just be calm, mister," Dave said. "We wasn't gonna do nothing." "Yeah," Ace asked. "Is that what you did to that girl? And Bobby?" Dave didn't reply. On the ground, Dex stirred and started crying. "Give me one good reason I shouldn't cut your throat out right now." "Daddy," Dex whimpered. "I have 3 kids," Dave said, after a moment's pause. That struck Ace as funny. He laughed and laughed. "You got 3 murdering fuck bags. That's what you got. You're probably all inbred too." "Daddy," Dex asked again. "Shut the fuck up," Ace spat. He looked at Sherry. She was still on her knees, watching him with hate in her eyes. Robert lying prone in the dirt. The back of his shirt was burned and blackened. Patches of flesh showed here and there, burned and blistered. He panted and moaned. Dex was on his knees now, hunched over like a Muslim praying. "You got 3 kids," Ace finally said into Dave's ear, "and I'll bet you're all they got, right?" Wordlessly, Dave nodded. "Not anymore." Ace dragged the knife across Dave's throat. Blood cascaded over his forearm. Sherry's eyes went wide. "Daddy!" Dave coughed and sputtered. Laughing, Ace shoved him aside. "Now!" Screaming, Dex popped up, his teeth bared and his eyes wide. His gun, Ace's gun, was in his hands. Ace fell back half a step. The first shot tore out his guts. The second hit him in the leg, and he started to fall. The third smashed into his head, and he knew no more. He had escaped permanently. They buried their father on a wind-swept plateau at dawn and marked the place with a stone. Sherry dug the grave while Dex wept. Robert was in the van. His wounds were bad. Sherry didn't know if he'd live to sundown. For a long time, Sherry and Dex stood over their father's grave, the former holding the latter. She knew vaguely that she was in charge now. She was responsible for her brothers now. They were all she had, and she was all they had. "Come on," she whispered, finally, and kissed Dex on the forehead. "Let's go." She climbed into the driver's seat and cast one final glance at the spot where her father rested, then drove away. Just beyond the grave, over the side of the steep cliff, 2 bodies lay broken on a pile of rocks. One had been beaten to death, the other had been shot. The wolves and buzzards ate for days. The valley. Of Rue Laith, posted by C Neighbour 7621. The light stretched across the valley. I could see for miles on end, yet I felt that I could reach out and grab the amber sunset from the sky. Perhaps it was sunrise. I'd lost my sense of time along my journey here to Rue Laith, the valley of the unseen king. As my eyes adjusted to the glare of the distant star, I could make out the scenery the old ones had described, the 3 plateaus on the distant horizon, gazing down on the valley, the river that segregated the sand and clay, whose shores bore the only vegetation throughout the valley. Even from this distance, I could feel the cool breeze of the water brushing against my skin. I descended the cliffs swiftly and advanced across the blazing sand towards the river. This place was strange though. It was visibly miles from the base of the cliff to the river. It took me just shy of 20 steps to reach the edge of the vegetation. What sort of force could cause this? Was something drawing me forward towards the river? Perhaps it was something beyond the river. As I stepped from the sand to the start of the grass, a sensation like none I felt before. It had taken months to find Rue Laith, and yet only moments to cross the entire desert. But the feeling of grass crunching beneath my feet and a fine mist coating my sun-scorched skin. I walked through the trees and brush, taking in the sight of how green everything was. As I come upon the river, it was stranger beyond any I had seen. Its flow was unusual, behaving as no river should. It flowed in both directions, from the opposite shore to the one I stood on. The water was lacking the blue tint as accustomed to most bodies of water, and instead favoured an ominous yellow coloration, the golden hues glistening off the sun's reflection. I plucked a fern from a near bush and dipped it into the water. It acted as one would expect, with no visible alterations, parched and near dehydration. As I emptied my water source the previous day, I leaned down and cupped a handful of the liquid, holding it to my nose. I detected a faint sweet smell. Carefully I sipped a portion into my mouth and swished it around. It tasted like normal water, so I decided to drink what was in my hands and wait a few moments. With no evident effects, I quickly slung myself into the water's edge and drank my fill until I felt I was about to burst. For the first time in many months, I felt joy wash over my body. I would wait here and rest for a time and recover from my journey. Feeling my body drained of the remainder of its energy, I drifted off to sleep. I dreamt I had walked into a cave. It was dark and malicious. Just the atmosphere of the place filled me with dread. I looked around and noticed there was 2 statues facing away from the cave's entrance. One was a sickly yellow figure, and the other a horrid scarlet colour. Though I could only see their outline, the sight caused me to weep uncontrollably. I awoke in a sweat that made me think I had been through a monsoon. What horrid things were those statues, and who would create such things? I thought to myself. I picked myself up from the ground and filled my water skin at the edge of the water. Once it was filled, I began wading through the strange golden waters to the other side of the river. Though it had seemed endless in depth from first glance, the water barely rose above my ankles as I crossed it. As soon as I stepped on the new shore, I became blinded by some unknown glare. I raised my hand swiftly to intercept and peered through the gaps in my fingers. There stood a faint outline of a distant tower. How was this not visible from the other shore? A massive structure such as this should have been visible from the cliffs. I took a single step forward and suddenly found myself at the entrance of a pearlesque city. What is happening? What kind of place is this? I thought to myself. The structures were even more bewildering than that of the river. The architecture was all wrong. It made no sense, no reasonable sense, as the buildings of my homeland. They were as round as a sphere, yet perfectly cubical at the same time. They varied in size from what appeared to be singular structures to huge monoliths that towered over the trees, their edges forming acute and obtuse angles simultaneously. Even though the buildings held no edges to begin with, what could create such things? I began walking down what I would imagine would represent a road, my mind flooded with questions of what magnificent being could have designed the city. I explored the town, marvelling at the sights for what must have been hours before it finally struck me. silence, though I was only on the outskirts since I had entered this place. I had heard no soul, not even my own footsteps or the sound of the river I had crossed. Panic and dread washed over me as I began looking about my surroundings. Though I had walked what I had thought to be a straight line, I was entirely surrounded by the structures now. I began spinning around frantically, looking for a path, beginning to hyperventilate. I grabbed my water skin and drank deeply, trying to calm myself, my mind racing with fear and anxiety. I collapsed. I was back in the cave, but I was further than I previously was, or so I think. The statues both rested out of my peripherals. Dread and terror washed over my body. I slowly turned towards the yellow statue, its wretched colour cloaking its body. My eyes burned as I looked upon its figure, its tentacle roots reaching out and corrupting the world around it. Though its gaze was looking further into the cave, I knew my mind would shatter if those eyes were upon me. It wore a golden crown whose origin not even the greatest scholar could guess. I turned to the Scarlet One, its horned head wearing the same crown as the other, its eyes gazing upon the same spot as the other. Its body looked twisted like a cloth being wringed out, yet bloated as a drowned corpse. I blinked. Suddenly they reached their hands outstretched and pointed to the spot they had been looking at. I turned to view the black abyss they directed towards. Terror washed over me, my ears screaming with countless whispers. My eyes burned as if someone had poured molten lead directly into my pupils. Every fibre of my being begged me to awaken, and yet I stepped forward. Pushed by the force of the two kings, I awoke screaming at the top of my lungs, gripping my chest as my heart felt as though it was going to explode. I looked around at the buildings, though I was still in the ominous city. It was clear I was not where I had fallen. I was no longer surrounded on all sides by the structure, but by strange piles of what appeared to be salt. I stood slowly, looking at the nearest pile. It was the same height as most men. They were spaced close to 2 feet apart from one another. I reached out and touched it. As I did, the salt dissipated at my touch, revealing what lay beneath. I stared into the hole I had involuntarily created and viewed the half-rotted skull of a young woman, worms crawling in and out of her flesh, her eye oozing from where the bloating had caused them to pop. I turned and vomited. As I finished emptying my stomach, I looked up to a horror I had not expected. Hundreds of pillars filled the space I was in, and the more I looked, the more I realized where I was. This was no cemetery, where one would think horrendous mounds such as these would be placed. No, this was a gathering place, the horrid city's centre, and at its centre stood what I feared most. 3 pillars, differing in colour and height, 2 of which stood equal, a sickly yellow wooden pillar and a malicious scarlet pillar of stone. The third was black as the void, and yet so translucent I thought it was nothing more than air. As I looked upon the 3 pillars, I could see the scarlet and yellow one were half destroyed and crumbling. Each had been broken by an outshot branch of the third pillar's material. It seemed as though it had sprouted the piercing rods to destroy the other two. As I limped forward, exhausted, through the crowd of salt, I felt pushed by some force to move towards this pillar of unseen void. My legs shaking with each step, I stumbled into one of the pillars, watching the bloated, maggot-infested corpse staring me in the eye. As well, we fell to the ground. I stood looking at the two kings and their outstretched arms, turning to face the void. I walked steadily forward. They guided me to the darkness, so I shall go, if nothing else, but to be free of this cursed place. As I crossed the threshold, the black void before me faded, and before me stood a pile of the flesh and bone of man, their screams filling my ears as I looked upon them. Impaled, skinned, gutted and rotting, they screamed. In the centre a man hung, crucified, with his back ribs torn open, his lungs draped over his shoulders, his eyes, lips and ears removed, and upon the top of the cross sat a skull. Its jagged teeth glistened, its deer-like horns shined through the blood covering them. Suddenly the bodies began to move towards each other, caressing and embracing one another, their screams of pain shifting to pleasure as they moved towards the crucified man, pulled by an unknown force. I watched in terror as bones snapped, flesh melded together all around the tortured man. His face, dear God, his face, my face. I opened my eyes and gazed down upon the valley, the three plateaus in the distant horizon, the river whose banks bore the only vegetation for as far as the eye can see. I stood upon the cliff's edge, looking upon Rue Laith. Whatever lays within its borders must not be disturbed, and I shudder at the thought of the day it is. As long as I draw breath, it will remain the unseen king. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thanks for listening. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more content like this. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.